Yo, this is Aaron, and I decided to do a little slideshow showing what 10 years of artistic progress looks like when you're not an artist. Um, or how I learned to stop worrying and love being shitty. So to explain when I'm saying non-artist, I'm mostly using this term because I work with people that actually do art for a living, and I don't. So I still usually draw probably on average, I don't know, 1 to 2 hours a day, maybe more like two. Yeah, on average 2 hours a day, probably. When I'm actually doing my comic thing, which sometimes I'm not. Sometimes I don't draw for several weeks, and that just happens because I got other shit to do. Because I'm not an artist. Anyways, this is what that looks like. To give you an idea of what those 10 years have been for me, in 2010 I was a sophomore in college. So I was a sophomore in college, graduated in 2012, took a year off, essentially not of my own volition because of the recession. Went to grad school in Washington in 2014 for a year, decided that was shitty, and lost my funding. So I stopped that and started doing programming after that, part-time, and then worked in Japan for a year and started doing programming full-time since 2017. So I have been doing basically, for some of that time, I was only really working part-time, so I was drawing a lot more. But most of that time I was working full-time or going to school full-time, so let's look. So mostly what this decade has been me drawing a lot of freaking comics. I basically don't draw anything else anymore. In March 2010, I started drawing an autobiographical comic, and then I did a graphic novel, and since then, that's finished. I've been doing my long-form comic, Metacarpolis, which is now up to 693 pages. So you can get an idea. Over 1,000 pages during that time. It's a lot of comics. About 100 pages per year. When I'm kind of on track for doing things I want to do, I'm drawing about 3 pages per week right now, but a lot of times that drops off just because it's work crunch or holidays or things like that. So it averages out to about 100 pages per year versus if I was literally doing 3 pages a week, it would be 150 or so. Or 156 exactly. I don't know why I have to say or so. I can do math. So there's a lot of comics. This is kind of what I was doing before. I was drawing shitty. I wasn't drawing as much. I mean, a lot of my drawing is literally just sketching in my college notes, but I've been drawing since I was 10. So I actually found these are actually from the end of 2009, some charcoal drawings I did. I absolutely hate charcoal. It is just a mess. The actual medium to work with is not enjoyable in any way whatsoever to me. But I had to do it because I wasn't even auditing. Was I? I was either auditing or sitting in on a drawing class, which was hilarious because I was probably the most technically, I'm not going to say talented because that's not correct. I was the most technically competent artist in that drawing class because it was a beginner's drawing class, and I asked the teacher to not make me do another beginner's drawing class because this was probably my third or fourth one really. But drawing from life to me is not that difficult. I mean, it is difficult, but having a reference and drawing strictly from a reference is the least amount of thought you will ever have to put into drawing, in my opinion. So it was just funny because there were actual art majors in that class, and I was like, why are you an art major? You can't even draw. But that's just me being mean. But yeah, I guess it's people that decide they have had not a thought in their life before then and decide they're going to be an art major, and they're already 18 and they've never drawn before, I guess. So I don't know why. But yeah. So I was doing that, and I was drawing really shitty digital art. I just could not, for the life of me, anatomy. This is from a project that has been scrapped and cannibalized into many other things. And I was also drawing, this is actually from 2010, but I'd already been doing this for a year or so. But I was doing really crappy newspaper comics, and I was I don't know why I did this, because it's not like I'd drawn that many comics before, but I had created a comic for the school newspaper, which completely challenged myself to draw a comic that took place entirely from like this one angle in a car. So I was trying to break out of that, obviously, but I was like, it's literally just, that is the challenge, is to draw these comics within this car and make jokes that fit that. And in that time, I also started doing like well, I had already been doing some autobiographical comics, but I was doing like college themed ones with my friends now. And the story behind this is actually funny. At the time, the site, oh hell, I don't even remember the name of the site anymore. It's the site that hosted, I don't even know if they still host it anymore. I'm sure they do, but they hosted Zero Punctuation, the game review series by Yahtzee. And they were like, had a webcomic competition where it's like, we'll actually pay you to make comics, submit your comics. And it was funny because I with my poor drawings, but back then there was a much lower standard for webcomics in general that quickly got blown out of the water in about 2 years. Like, I still was good enough to like receive comments back from the people they had judging, which included, I think Brian Clevenger did that, which is funny because I program his sites now. But it was amusing to me because they were trying to get somebody to make a gamer webcomic, and I was like, I'm not really interested in doing the gaming webcomic. I just mostly want to draw comics. But it was amusing to me because in typical late 2000s, early 2010s fashion, completely oblivious to context as white men judging these things typically are. They chose, as the winner, they chose a comic that was, I believe the title was called Critical Miss. And it was a female protagonist, like, and, you know, part of the joke is like, oh, it's a girl that plays video games. And I was like, looked at it and I was like, seriously? Because it was done by like 2 guys. And I was like, really? That's interesting. I'm sure they know a lot about what it means to be a female nerd. I'm sure that the jokes will be just spot on. But I found that very amusing, but I was like, I'm not surprised I didn't win this because I didn't really want to draw a gamer webcomic, but it was interesting to get some feedback, and considering that I could not draw that well, but it was still pretty decent for the level that was being sent there. And I was also doing this thing where, you know, you draw one background and then you just kind of copy paste it, you know, which, you know, it's acceptable within this crappy context. This was some other, kind of get a context on other art was doing at the time. This was off of a reference. This was a gift for a friend. And this was just, I think that, yeah, this was for my website, and it's literally just me trying at my best to draw the human form, and obviously it's much easier with the reference, but this was not with a reference. But I find it funny that I'm much more probably adept and interested at drawing like hair and folds rather than just drawing a face correctly. And I'm sure I drew that hand off of a reference photo. Well, maybe not, because I didn't have... Did I have a camera phone at that time? But yeah. Excuse me. I'm not going to edit this, so... You'll just have to deal with me sneezing. So, beyond that, this was like the very few kind of drawings I was doing outside of comics, because already everything outside of comics and just like sketches in my notebook was disappearing completely at this time. But I find it funny that like even at this point, pretty relatively early on, I was experimenting with different art styles. I think I was basing a lot of this art off of what was I basing? I was basing it off of something specific. This is from an Edgar Allan Poe story, and I think I was basing this off of like old horror comics that I was studying at the time for a class. And this is just like showing basic, but I think it's really funny how, like, to me it's very obvious, like, the struggles I have with just drawing a normal face and hand and a person standing. But I was I was trying very hard so I could make it look fairly normal, but I just remember how much of a struggle it was to draw just like anything, because when you're just drawing sketches here and there, a lot of times it's very easy to skip over things that you have difficulty drawing. But when you've written an idea for a comic and you're like, I'm going to make this comic, then you're confronted with the fact that you have to actually draw what you've written. So you can only take so many shortcuts if you're trying to get a point across. So comics to me are like the best way to just get good at drawing a lot of stuff, because if you are actually legitimately trying to convey your ideas, you will have to draw a lot of stuff you're not comfortable with drawing. And you just get to work on it a lot. At this, a little bit later on, I believe I started drawing this. Actually, I did see this. On DeviantArt, I marked this as December, which I had actually started on this earlier. I had written the script for this in April 2010, I believe. Either 2009 or 2010, but it was for the first, I think, the very first iteration of what was called Script Frenzy, which was a spin-off of NaNoWriMo. And I don't even know if it exists anymore, but I was like, instead of a movie script, which I had tried to do before, and I was like, wow, I really don't care about movies, I made a comic script. So I did the first draft of that completely within that month, which was good in that you have a very short focus to look at the whole story, so you don't like forget what has gone on and everything, but also bad because I had never done that before. Like, I had written a few novels, and just trying to write a story out in a novel is so different than trying to get it in a comic. But this was, at the end of that year, I started drawing it after doing some edits, probably not nearly enough edits as I should have done. And I had to keep editing it as it went on, but I did the first pages of Four Tales, my horror graphic novel from back in the day. And wow, it just opened up a whole can of like, I just don't know how to draw shit. Honestly, the biggest issue with this comic was me not really knowing how to accomplish the effect I want, which was like Victorian woodblock prints with their cross hatching, but I didn't really understand how they achieved that, and I just like struggled with it constantly. But I just ended up settling on, how I was gonna do it. And then confronted with the fact that I just don't know how to draw people at all. So like drawing every little interaction between like a person and an object is just a complete struggle. And also like making people like consistent and in proportion next to each other. Like, hey, draw an adult next to a child and their sizes are both correct. It's just remembering all the struggles I had 10 years ago, where you can't see it as much in the page, but man, I do remember it. And then you can see like something I'm drawing at the same time, really, really crappy coloring, and just like, what is this face shape? But yeah, like everything is a struggle. And I was still am very poor at color, but like I would try painting, and I do a lot of like painting where you're just like going off of reference and color dipping and trying to replicate what you see. What is the term? Using like the dropper tool to fetch colors and things, but desperately trying to do that stuff in the background. I just don't know what I'm doing. But I did have some fun little explorations where I was actually taking a class called, I believe it was called Comics and Culture. But got to learn a lot about comic history, and I got to look at a lot of images that really inspired me. So this was a takeoff of Morphine and Me, which I think this was actually one of the comics that Frederick Wertham, is that right? Frederick Wertham talked about in his book Seduction of the Innocent. But this was like the very end of horror comics before they all got nixed by American Puritans. But I did some takeoffs of that, which I'm sure just completely, they 100% definitely went over people's heads, but it did make for some fun and striking little things I could do, but just like copying other people's designs and compositions. But like within the actual zine itself, you can see the thing too, where it's like, I have to draw this thing, I have to draw a person getting into bed, and I have to draw them from like this angle, and I'm like, I don't know how to do that. And so you're just fucking around and finding out. And I had some interesting experiments where, like, with my actual drawings, I was thinking about, like, composition, putting things together, and I was maybe compensating for, like, the fact that I just can't draw by, like, at least trying to focus on composition more and things like that, and just, learn how to make things visually appealing even when I can't necessarily accomplish what I'm trying to do. So, visual appeal, working within limitations outside of my comics. But then, of course, the comics just show, like, the downfalls of, like, how does hand hold hat? How does face work? How does hair work? What is my skull here? And obviously I'm being harsh on myself, but I'm more just marveling at how much easier a lot of these things are now that I've drawn literally 1,000 pages of comics. And once again, like, trying to do cool things with composition, but just having troubles with some execution where it's like, I can put as much detail and cool feathers and whatever here, but I just can't draw the hands. So it's, like, very obvious that I don't know how to color any of this. So at least 2010, 2011 was, Aaron was like, hey, maybe the characters from the story aren't white. Which might be better than some people are doing in their, I guess, early 20s. And then I just thought this was amusing where, like, my 100th strip for Works in Progress, which was my autobiographical comic at the time, was once again, like, a retrospective where I went back and looked at some of my really old art, and it's pretty interesting. And this is more from Works in Progress, and I was more amused by the fact that some of these individuals turned out to be real assholes. And I'm like, now it's preserved forever in comic form, so I always get to remember how they let me down as individual human beings. So here's more. I'm actually going to go through more of Four Tales now, but once again, just a lot of this stuff where I think a lot of people look at what I was doing in Four Tales and was like, some people would be like, wow, Aaron, I didn't know you could draw so good. I'm like, the drawings aren't good, I just have a lot of lines on them. It doesn't take a lot of effort to just put a lot of lines on the page. And for some reason, you get this weird effect where, like, having more random lines on the page makes it kind of obscures the actual drawing and makes it look better than it is. Which happened with a lot of Four Tales, and it was funny when I started Metacarpolis, and I had essentially taken away the extra lines, and I was like, wow, the art looks a lot worse, huh? But it's mostly just, like, turns out that paring things down to the most cartoony elements really exposes every single flaw you have, whereas with this style, you can cover up a lot of sins. Like the fact that I don't know how to draw a waist and a leg and a hand. So you're working, and things can be a kind of stiff. Have a lot of trouble making, like, good, fluid, natural poses for people. And I know, once again, I sound very self-critical, but there were a lot of things that I learned doing this comic that I think made it really interesting. Like, I like the striking, I like the contrast on this page from top to bottom and the composition and everything. And some things I did that I did do within this style where I did a bit better with some of the cross-hatching here. But just learning how to emphasize elements, do page layouts, things like that. And I really like this page, except for the fact I can't draw her face here. But I liked the composition and the visual elements, and, cheating a little bit with realism to make the composition more interesting. And, of course, bringing into what has always been a great theme in all my comics, which is horrible things happening to small children, which, if you think I'm ever going to take that out, then you're wrong. But, yeah. But I think, I aside from that, I thought this page was interesting because I believe, I remember drawing this in I can't believe I remember that. I was drawing this in a hotel room in State College. But just, like, trying to draw, once again, just, like, interactions between two people where objects are interacting and everything has to make sense together. I was like, oh, this actually turned out pretty okay in that sense. And then more experimenting with style. It's funny because you think that this style would be a lot faster than cross-hatching, but it's really it's really not, which goes on to like Metacarpolis. It's like, well, you think the less lines would be less work, but it's not really. And more horrible things happening to children. And one of my other favorite themes is unexpectedly ramped up violence that I don't warn you about because fuck you. Dead birds. I really liked this drawing where like I felt like I had much more control over the cross hatching here, but I just couldn't translate it to everything else in the comic. I was obviously working off a reference for this, and I guess it just seemed a lot more evident what I should do when I was looking at the picture versus here where I'm like, I have no idea what I'm doing here. And some other places where like I like the hatching on this dragon. I did an okay job with the hatching on her. And overall the composition for this page, I really like it. Even though there's some cheating going on. And then just like looking towards the end of this comic and I'm getting tired and I now suddenly have to draw adults and I'm just like, I don't know how to draw adults. I don't know how to draw these faces. What is happening here? So yeah, that ended. I was like, oh my god, I did a whole graphic novel. Thank God I don't have to do that again. So I decided, hey, why not draw a 4-volume long story that will take me pretty much a decade to draw. I mean, I got other stuff done in that time, so I don't really care. But this is when I started Metacarpolis, and I remember distinctly asking people, it's like, well, I did black and white for Four Tales, and I did this page, and I did it in black and white, and I was like, yeah, I was thinking of just sticking with black and white, and I was like, but do you think I should do color? And, you know, of course, the non-artist I was talking to said, oh, of course you should do color, whereas artists with more knowledge at the time would say, no, draw black and white, it's cheaper and faster. And this page probably looks better in black and white because I intended it to be in black and white. But I was like, well, I have no idea how to color, but I guess I'll color anyways. So you can see my very first attempt at like coloring a comic page, I think. But I started to learn how to do some color things, and even if some of them were like, what, I was like, well, at least the effect is happening. And this was some other art that I was doing at the time where I was like really trying to figure out how to make color stuff work. This is, of course, fan art. And sometimes just straight up cheating by making things essentially monochrome because I was like, well, I'm okay with value, I just can't do color. And some other times where I was like, okay, really, really trying this color thing, and I'm just like, I have no idea what's happening. So like the values are okay. It's has that weird smoothness property in some places. Still don't know how to like do highlights and contrast, but I was like, at least it looks all right. And then once again, like trying to compensate for things with better composition and form and like essentially monochrome to cover up the fact that I can't color. Although I like this is a little GIF that I made that was this was Night Vale fan art. The blinking light up on top of the mountain, which I don't even remember how I made this. I was smarter back then. But yeah, so here's basically everything from here for quite a while is going to be Metacarpolis pages, but some of the same problems I had with Four Tales were in Metacarpolis, where I was like, especially because I completely changed styles, and it was not even style particularly that was like a natural style for me. It was even more cartoony than my cartoony style. And just not having any idea how to make these characters consistent, and like realizing I'd drawn like one concept sketch of this character, and I was like, well, I don't actually know how he looks from these other angles, and then having to draw that character for the next 10 years. So like Emmy really had trouble drawing her face shape, and Max drawing his face shape. But I was once again doing, I had some okay ideas with like composition and trying to make interesting pages to tell a story. And like obviously not every page is that interesting because a lot of them is just like there's dialogue you have to do, and you can only make it so interesting. But like when I had the opportunity, I like to do the more interesting things. And I got to draw like my first actual action scenes, which at first I was like completely terrified of. I drew this in, the end of 2012. I was in Boston for Connecticon, and I remember drawing this page. And I was really enjoyed it. I was like kind of shocked because like I did this and I was like, huh, that was kind of fun. And then I realized like, oh, action can be kind of fun to draw because it's only bad to draw if you like have no idea how like angles and human body parts go together. But I was getting a little bit better at that. So at least I could do what I needed to do even if it didn't look perfect at all times. And had that same thing going on here where I was like, whoa, like this page was actually really cool and fun to put together, and like I can make like cool poses and interesting composition choices, and I was like, oh, this is what happens when you start to be able to like draw people. And so like I said, not perfect, but I can at least sensibly put together the page. And then just like having a bunch of shit crammed on there. I mostly put this because I was like amused by the number of non-backgrounds or just gradient backgrounds, and I was like, I've mostly abandoned this at this point because like I mostly because I was frustrated because I was like, oh, this is just a way to get out of doing backgrounds. But then I brought some of it back just for places where I was like, it really would be more effective to not have the background distracting from this. But yeah, this was like hilarious. But between these backgrounds, but also having to get the consistency of like height and proportion for like 4 characters in a panel, I was like, oh, this is much better than I was able to do even 2 years before this. And then I ended up looking back at this, and I really liked the color for this page. But I was doing a lot of Metacarpolis. The color is essentially just taking base colors and unifying them with multiple layers, but on some of these it's just, you know, transitioning through these color schemes and things like that. It's better than I could do previously, at least. It's some of it's cheating, but it's at least like aesthetically okay cheating. But I just liked doing these kinds of panel layouts when I did my flashback storytelling type things. And then I don't know what's going on with coloring this page, but I just think it's funny. I always look back at this page and I'm like, what the hell is going on with these faces here? Where I'm like, I still just obviously don't know how to draw my own characters in these pages, which is like a consistent theme. Do concept art, kids. But I thought this was interesting as well, where I did this little drawing as one of my chapter break drawings, which I essentially just do to give myself time to work on my buffer and have a slight break, let the potato have a rest. But I thought this was interesting because there's a lot more understanding of like how bodies are put together and things like that. Like, and this wasn't a complete struggle to draw, except for just trying to figure out how this would look, because I couldn't really find a lot of reference photos for like hands putting a bun in hair. But I liked drawing all the folds and everything. I was like, I don't even know if these are accurate, but these are enjoyable to do, and they look okay. And so coming back to it, you're like, oh yeah, I'm starting to just like do all this stuff naturally without really thinking too hard about it and without having to use 10 million reference photos. And I just like this, once again, using this structure to kind of tell flashbacks and things, but kind of once again doing this thing where I've written a thing and then I have to illustrate it. And you start turning in where it's like, oh god, I wrote this thing and now I have to illustrate it. But you really get to draw when you do that, and you stick to drawing what you actually write. You end up learning a lot of things, like what did Spanish missionaries wear in the 1600s. I still can't really figure out what they wore for shoes, so they're kind of... but I was like literally looking through fashion designs. It's like, what did English settlers wear in this time? What did Spanish conquistadores wear? But it's funny how just like even in this dumbass comic, there's weird things you end up learning and forcing yourself to draw. And doing a better job with foliage here than I ever did in Four Tales. And then once again here drawing action scenes where I liked this, where it's like, okay, this action makes sense, but then I just really like this 5-panel sequence here. Just, that's one of the best faces in the comic. But yeah, being more comfortable with drawing action scenes, which is something I'd never really done. I guess it helps. I realized that it helps and hurt a little bit that I had done a lot of martial arts by this point. 4 or so years worth of martial arts. And just... at least I knew how to draw, like, a kick. I guess that's much better than a lot of people can do, but knowing how, I guess it helps that I kind of know how bodies move within these situations for the most part. But it also hurts in later places, and I'll talk about that when I get there. But I was just showing this off because I was also really proud of just like then how the color ended up on this page, where I was able to get some like natural texture here that I never got before, and being able to convey size and distance. And where I was drawing these pages and I was like, there's literally like nothing on this. It's literally just a desert, but I was like so proud of these pages. And then here too, where it's like not much is happening, but I was able to, I things that I hadn't thought about at the beginning of the comic, like environments giving details about characters and things like that, where I was thinking, I had to kind of think of them on the fly because I hadn't thought of them before, but where I was suddenly thinking of them a lot more, and I was like, well, these things just started coming naturally, where before I was like, what the hell do I put in Emmy's apartment, where I was like, Becca probably has like a way overdone bed and like basically nothing else because she probably doesn't do anything else in her bedroom, and would have something very utilitarian at her bedside. And I was just like, I don't know why, but that seems right. But the reason I had pulled out this page originally was just like, I was like, oh, I can draw her arms, and like I was slightly figuring out how to draw like, I guess I should say one short people. I'm not a short person, so I don't have short person for reference, sorry. And just like different shapes of people, whereas like Becca is meant to be almost like two circles sitting on top of each other, and then legs tapering down. And I was like learning how I could take those, like pare down a character to something simplified, and then being able to draw them all situations. And it's not as obvious here, but I was just like, oh, I actually knew how to draw Becca kind of on this page. Whereas Max and Max's father always irritate because they're just skinny men are just like straight boards, and it's so hard to like convey the actual figure that their body has because they have so little figure. Women are much more fun to draw, although I'm getting better at drawing guys, but it's still just like, ugh, men. But yeah. So I thought this was interesting too, because I had these two new characters that I had introduced for the comic, and you know, obviously this was something that was going to happen from the beginning of the comic, but I didn't really draw concept art much. I was just like, well, Max's father mostly looks like Max, but there were some differences, and I was just kind of impressed in these first few panels. I was like, this is one of those few times like a new consistent character is introduced, and like he actually looks consistent here basically with how he appears later and within the page here. And I was like, oh, I'm getting better at like figuring out how to draw people consistently, whereas Max has evolved completely from how he first looked, but at least I'm also starting to learn to draw him consistently. So sorry, I really love these first pages with Max's dad just because he's a complete asshole, and it's great. And Max gets to find out that he's angry. So I just enjoyed the faces in here. He's always a joy to draw. But yeah, having some more consistency with being able to draw like new characters. Although this angle, like, what the fuck is happening here? And once again, I was looking at this because like, yeah, I was able to much more naturally draw these scenes, whereas like before, 2-3 years before this, I was like, oh god, how do I draw somebody like flying on a broom and having it look natural? But I was just here, so I was like, yeah, it just looks like this. In the skyline, actually, this is one of the better skylines, where I was learning another tricky thing is how to simplify backgrounds enough to where they don't clutter up the foreground too much. It's an underrated skill, but like the suggestion of a background where it looks good without taking away too much from what's happening in the foreground. Still struggle with it. Another page I was just showing off because I'm proud of. I just love the progression of this. This was just me having fun on a page, but I love doing pages like this. For some reason, this is also another one of my favorite pages, and I think, I don't know why, I think I just loved like this I don't know, Cecily turned out so well in these few panels, and then I just shit on English majors here, which is funny because I also have an English major. So yeah, but I just loved, I think this in particular, I loved how her hair turned out. So I only bring up this page because I'm fairly sure it's this page, which is the first one that I drew when I ran out of my regular drawing paper in Japan, and I had to find completely different drawing tools when I was living in Japan. This was from beginning of 2016 to the beginning of 2017. And so in Japan, it's actually not much easier to find the paper, but they don't have the same kind of paper. They have this a little bit flimsier paper, which is like their standard manga drawing paper, and it's about, no, it's not even 11 by 14. It's like 9 by 14 or 10 by 14, but it's a standard size, but it's about 30% smaller than 11 by 17, which is what I usually draw on. But I just have really shaky hands, so it's very difficult for me to draw small with any consistency, especially when I'm doing inking. So you can see there's like a weird, not necessarily a dip, but if you look at these pages in context, there's just like a really weird change in texture because what I was using, Fudenosuke pens. I was using Fude pens, which are just like brush pens that contain ink within the brush, and I was just like, I didn't know what I was doing. Before that, I think I've been using actual brushes, which was also terrible. Now I use a much better kind of brush pen, and I've been using that for like 3 years consistently now, and it's wonderful. But just literally 6 years into this comic, and I'm still figuring out materials, especially because, you know, having to find materials in a completely different country when you barely speak the language is real fun. But this page turned out okay. I another character that's fun to do just 'cause I love just complete assholes. And this was another, you can see that having a lot of trouble with some of these materials, just trying to get any consistency in line weight, but able to mask some of that with composition and things like that. But yeah, it's just like, I can't with these brushes. But I really liked this chapter cover. This is one I had been wanting to do forever, and it was, I think I've broken it now because I had to do something funky with the CSS on my site to get it work, but this was actually cut the site in half, and now I kind of want to look it up and see if it's still on the site. Don't mind my desktop. Let's see. I know the thumbnail definitely does not work properly. It almost works. But this actually broke out of the border. Oh, I see here. I can make this work for now. Take away the max width. Yeah, so this this is what I had, like, I've been looking forward to doing this for like 2 years, and I was like, yeah, it's gonna look cool. It's a good thing I know CSS. But yeah, this just doesn't work long. I guess I can put in, I might just put in like a specific script to make this work just because it looks so cool. But yeah, I really loved this effect. But this comic, this chapter was like my fucking white whale. I just could not. I think a part of it was also drawing it in Japan when I was like working with materials I wasn't used to, and this is somewhere where I was going to mention that I had a lot of fun with some of the parts of this action scene, and I was like, I really liked what I did here, and it looked really great in black and white, and the color also looked good. But there were some places where I was realizing that, like, oh, this action scene really should have been truncated, but I was already in the middle of doing it, and I had outlined everything, and I was just like, it was going on forever. And I think it reads probably okay in archival format, but it was like literally a year-long chapter, especially because I was going slower because I was working full-time in Japan. But it was just like, reading it when it was actually coming out, I think was probably very painful because of the slow rate at which this action scene came out. But it's probably much more bearable as an archive because it's not like literally a year-long action scene. But some of the things where I was saying the martial arts knowledge kind of hurt me on this was that there are some things that you do in martial arts which are like, they're not like choreographed things that you would see in a movie, because they're very subtle and hard to capture, where like even really there's very few like even like movie action directors that are good at capturing like this subtle action. It's why most action is really overblown, just because it's really hard to convey visually what's happening. Whereas if you're sparring, it's pretty easy to figure out. But there's some things where I was like, this is a little bit too, some of the things I did were a little bit too martial artsy, and I was like, this doesn't really, I was like, I don't know if this really makes sense for in this medium. Whereas like with this page, there's big action, and some of it was like, I was like, you wouldn't really do this in real life, whoa. But it looks good on the page, and it makes sense, like it flows from place to place. So I over this excruciating journey of like 30-40 pages of this action scene, I was like learning, it's like, oh, some of this thing really could have been truncated and made more punchy, where I did that later a little bit better. And I also just like this page where I was like getting a bit better at drawing just like organic figures without it looking too weird. And I also noticed as I drew this that this was kind of funny, because I don't think I did this on purpose, but they're all playing cards, and then these 3 reaction panels look like a hand of cards. I don't think I did that on purpose, but it really subconsciously works within the page. And then this is like one of the pages I love best, because I was like, oh my god, how am I going to convey this action happening? But then I was like, I like laid out the page and like started drawing it. I was like, oh, this is exactly what I wanted. This is exactly how I wanted to show it. And when I posted the page, people were like, oh my god, like not freaking out, but like they understood what was happening, or like at least some grasp of what was happening. And I was like, oh, that sequence is one of those rare occasions where you're like, oh, that went exactly how I wanted it to go. And I was getting like more and more of that. And I also I had no idea what to do for this chapter cover, but then I ended up doing this, and I ended up really liking it, especially like things you learn later kind of reflect back into this cover, and I started being okay with doing a much simpler style of chapter cover I had been doing for the past couple. And I was showing this as well, just to be like, oh, look, I'm starting to kind of learn how to draw faces from angles. Oh my goodness. Oh my god. Oh, it's a slightly downturned angle, although his head probably should have been further down here. But I just think it's funny, where it's like these things that you probably don't even notice in the moment, but like in my head, I know that it's like, wow, I just learned how to draw a head from that angle. 6 years in. So same kind of thing here, where it's like some of these things I would have struggled so much with like 6-7 years before this, and just no problem here. Just something about the ease of it, remembering how much easier it is very satisfying. And also trying to do the thing with like environmental details, and remembering to put in all the props that are needed for this scene, like the flashlight. So I mostly just show this because this is the beginning of like the literal volume of backstory that gets told here, and I'm glad that people didn't seem to get too frustrated with this. It wasn't as bad as just like a year-long action scene, but I knew going into this that this was like literally going to be like 150 pages of backstory, but I was like, well, at least the story itself is interesting, so hopefully. And then back to my nemesis of 1, drawing children, and 2, children being violent with each other. Children being violent with each other. Being a child is very violent. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. So yeah, I just progressing through this, having some not too much to talk about. I had some times here where like I really ended up liking the composition, and using sorry, I just don't have as much to talk about, because I was just like, hey, this mostly repeated points, being able to draw things from different angles without as much difficulty, being able to draw like hands mostly, but like I liked this page because I was able to do, I was like, I don't even know if people like caught the point of some of these panels, but being able to do some storytelling that's not just through dialogue, but rather through like actions and things like that. And I just point out this page because I was like, hey, I allowed myself to do a full spread without any interruption. And mostly looks pretty good. And then here I was just talking about learning things from that last action scene where I was able to do this much more efficiently than the other action scene. And there's some errors in this scene, but I'd also started doing sword fighting at this point. So it was funny because I kind of knew, as with the other chapter, I actually kind of knew what I was doing. I was like, oh, she's just going to do a straight slice, and then she's going to go into an ox, or whatever you want to call this guard, and she's going to deflect down and then use this momentum to, yeah. I was like playing out the sword fight, and I was like, yeah, this is the thing that actually happens. But this whole little action scene right here, I think it was literally took like 4 pages. Because I wanted to make it really concise, whereas before I hadn't been as concise, and I was like, oh, that worked out a lot better. And then just drawing faces and people from angles and having small details even with the clothing and things like that. It was just things coming more naturally. I don't have quite as much to say about like the last 2 years worth of pages. I have much more trouble looking at more recent stuff. I have trouble looking at Marcus, Mr. Babyface here, but I did like this sequence of 4 and Becca throwing up everywhere, because this was like a scene. I think I first scripted out this scene like 5-6 years ago, and I was just like, oh, this is the page where I get to draw Becca throwing up. I don't know why. That was comedic moments that I live for. I really liked this chapter cover because, like I said, allowing myself to be a bit more minimal but a little bit more experimental with the chapter covers, I think really worked out. So same thing here, whereas minimal but trying to be interesting chapter covers. And then, of course, my love of doing horrible things to children rears its ugly head again. But I liked the composition of this page, except for the part where I had to try to draw this consistently 4 times over. And here, this was something more recent, but I also liked there's not much happening on this page, but I liked the composition, and I liked the storytelling more with body movements instead of just straight dialogue. And I mean, it's stuff I've done before this, but I like focusing on it more. I think I put a little bit less in my pages detail-wise now, and I think that might have something to do with how I'm thumbnailing and why I was looking at the past 2 years more differently, but yeah, it was just interesting to look back at stuff and think of how and why things have changed and whether that's for good or for worse. Minimal covers that try to be more effective with just like composition. I really like this cover. There's literally nothing to it, but it says what the chapter's about. Like it said, these pages were like more minimal just because they're literally taking place in like a pitch black dark void, but which is funny because you think it's like, oh, this must be so much faster, but actually I do all these blacks by hand, and like these white parts are just traced. Not traced, like the white is not me drawing with a white marker or anything. It's literally just me drawing this and then outlining it with another marker and then filling everything in very meticulously with pens and Sharpies. And I'm not going to do that in the future because it's actually terrible. But I'm kind of stuck doing it now. And then I was just showing off this most recent chapter cover because I didn't realize it till I'd done, but it was just flexing on past self being able to kind of draw feet, but also flexing on Rob Liefeld, showing him that I can draw feet and he can't. So yeah, I'm a better artist than Rob Liefeld. So this is just some other stuff from like the past 4, 5, 6 years that was not comics, because like I said, I stopped drawing basically anything else because I feel like nowadays every time I try to sit down and draw something that's not comics, I'm like, but what if it was the actual comic instead? Which is not great because sometimes you need to like draw concept art and stuff in anticipation, and I never do. But I found this funny. This was from when I was in Washington in 2014, I guess. And having like things aren't perfect now, but like being able to this was much more quick and organic than I'd ever been able to draw before that. Like having anything that looks like this, where this is basically a sketch, is like far above what I was doing in 2010. And I even forgot that I did this. I guess this was like, I looked at this and I was like, oh, did I post this somewhere? And I think I did, but I guess I didn't finish the broom for some reason. This is actually really cute, and I liked what I did with the dress because what I learned in Four Tails was I have absolutely no idea how to draw a dress when your like legs are bent at all, because I don't wear dresses, so I just don't know. But I was just like, oh, whatever, just fake it and then draw a big fakey ribbon that doesn't actually happen in real life, but looks cute. So, and the flip flops. Drawing Emmy, and like I didn't know what clothes to put her in forever ago, and now I'm just like, draw her in anything cute and everything cute that I saw girls wearing in Japan, and that's just how it is. And this was, I liked this where I was like, once again, the colors are just cheating with monochrome, but it looks fine. This is me drawing myself as a big creepy person, because I am. And this was a lot of the stuff I did recently where I actually had to go back and look at PSDs, because like, wow, I didn't finish like any drawings, and it's because I would get really into it and then be like, wow, this is terrible, I don't want to finish this, or just like, this is boring, I don't want to finish this. But I did do like more, I guess essentially like pen sketches in my journal, and now I had this trouble where because of Metacarpolis all my heads are too big, and I was like, big head gang. So I'm trying to fix that in my actual sketchbook now. And I did some other, like I said, I did some other finished drawings, and I had some more success by essentially doing the initial drawing in ink, and then when I went to color it, I was like, having the ink drawing already there to build upon made it a lot easier. And I think I based this off of not the Okavango. There's a seasonal floodplain in Africa that I based this off of, where it's a seasonal delta that doesn't drain into the sea. It's really cool. But I was able to do some things with color that really, I would only do them sometimes, and really a lot of this stuff was stuff I learned from Metacarpolis, but it just doesn't, it looks like I just pulled this completely out of my ass. I was like, no, I learned this from doing the comics. It's just, and I learned this while doing it. Like this coloring style, a lot of this is very similar to what I do in Metacarpolis, just more detail, more different color usage, using some different brushes for texture that I wouldn't use in Metacarpolis because it would mess with the look of it. But yeah, I'm basically liked what I did here, and I was like, yeah, I can do some color better than I could before. And I still was like, yeah, I'm still sampling off of reference photos, and this was just something I drew the other day. It was like, I don't know, 3 hours. This is a big cheater picture. I was not just using a reference photo, but I had done the color editing to the reference photo, and I was like sampling colors off of that. But I was trying to it's mostly just a practice piece, because it was like, I don't know if I can paint at all. So I was like, I'll just try some paint so I can do a new self-portrait. So it turned out really well, but I'm not gonna lie, like there's a ton of cheating going on to this, and people are like, wow. I'm like, yeah, it's a big cheat. This is all fake. But I mean, the painting is all real. It's not like I just did a filter or something, but it's just like, yeah, I was very heavily referencing, and really the only thing artistically I brought to this was choosing the initial colors. And I did do some very minor modifications. Like I gave myself long hair because I'll probably have long hair by the end of this year, and I wanted to use it as a profile pic. But like I kind of edged in some of the shadows here to make myself look a little bit meaner than I did in the reference photo, just because I wanted to look like a real asshole in this profile photo. So yeah, I was like, but I'm not interested in doing this kind of painting very often, because one, it requires me to have a reference. I'm not good at painting. I like picking colors like this right off the bat, and I'm not good at like I mean, I can draw like vaguely realistic things without a reference, but it just doesn't interest me that much. Like I did that for all of Four Tails, where I'd use this pseudo-realistic style, and I'm just like, I don't find it as interesting as like experimenting with different cartoon styles. So what did I learn by drawing? What this decade mostly taught is that speed is great. There's a very good video on this that I found. I'll try to find it and link it somewhere, but it made a very good point that drawing faster is pretty much always better for practicing, because the faster you draw within a certain amount of time, the more repetition you can do. So no matter what, you are getting in more practice by drawing faster. And that's definitely been true with me drawing comics, where I draw comics much faster than I used to, and so I get a lot more iteration happening over time. And iteration is necessary on the path to progress. The secondary caveat I'll make to that is kind of the thing I live by is the phrase, which doesn't sound very good on its own, but my explanation hopefully will make it better. But the phrase "perfect practice makes perfect," and what I kind of mean by that is that I've seen a lot of people that do the kind of practice makes perfect thing, where they will literally just sit there and do the same thing for several hours, and they have not improved over the course of that several hours because they literally were playing it wrong when they started, and they never really put any thought into how to correct that, and so they just continue playing it wrong for sorry, I'm literally thinking of a violist I used to know. So they play it wrong when they're starting the practice session. 2 hours later, they're still playing it wrong. It's like you repeated the wrong thing over and over, and you did not improve. I also had a choir teacher that this is a completely fake bullshit thing that she probably made up as far as the numbers go, but she said it takes 5 repetitions to learn how to play something correctly, but if you learn how to play it wrong, it will take 125 repetitions to then unlearn how to play it wrong and learn how to play it correctly. And I'm like, well, that's completely bullshit, made up number. You just cubed 5. But I do believe that if you learn something wrong the first time and you kind of embrace that wrong method, it takes much, much more work to then slowly correct that method. And I mean, I've had this argument with people before where I'm like, I've seen it happen a lot with music and art, where people will embrace a certain way of drawing things, a thing that really hampers their ability to make it look good. I won't say draw it correctly, because that's not, drawing correctly is not really a thing. It's making it work within that context. And they continue to draw it that way, and they do it over and over to the point where it's like it takes a lot more work to then undo the damage that you've done to your method by drawing it that way. So, but the answer to that is not perfectionism. It's to, every time you draw something and you repeat on it, say, what did I do here? How can I improve this? So when I say perfect practice makes perfect, I mean that thoughtful, consistently meaningful practice does a lot more for you than just strict repetition. So putting a thought into every single thing you do, but also iterating very quickly, where you can say, you don't mull over it forever. You draw an eye and say like, that looks kind of weird. You draw it again, and it's like, that was a little better. You draw it again, and it's like, oh no, that was worse. So you just keep going over and over and looking at references and comparing and iterating upon your ideas until you are able to get closer and closer to what the ultimate ideal form of that is. And that goes with, the next thing I learned was consistency, which is just like the idea of being, drawing, how should I say this, both consistency in output and consistency in within the content. So drawing comics really helped me learn how to consistently draw the same things over and over from many different angles, and that's just the very practical interpretation of the term consistency, is like actually being consistent within the work of being able to convey your ideas correctly from panel to panel, but then consistently just as far as scheduling, which I obviously have not always been able to do this, but obviously I've also drawn 1,000 pages over the course of 10 years, so I am somewhat consistent, whereas I don't really buy into the being a perfectionist on every page and drawing maybe 100 pages in that same amount of time, because you stopped and started and you really relied on motivation and mood rather than discipline. And obviously there's some times where it's like, this is like, something will happen that's just so derailing and so horrible you just have to put down the pencil for a second, or just you're too busy. But usually when I sit down and draw comics, it's not because I'm like, oh, I feel like drawing comics right now. It's more because now is the time to draw comics. And that sounds very dull, but like the truth of it is, if you want to produce something and your ultimate goal is to tell a story and produce it and get it out there and push it out into the world, you have to sit down and do it. I mean, I learned that earlier from writing prose with things like NaNoWriMo. It's like, if you don't sit down and do it every day, or at least do it on a schedule, then you're never going to make anything and you're never going to get any better. You're only going to just kind of flail at a thing and not really master it. So the other thing I learned is how to draw more good. I'm actually really bad at, like, I do a lot of practice internally, but I'm very bad at going and, like, working on, like, actually drawing from life and things like that, where sometimes I'll go, like, I'll do, like, an hour of life drawing and be like, wow, I was drawing that wrong, or something like that. But sometimes I just, like, I don't care to look up references, or I don't care to check that, like, my drawing has strayed from real life. Weirdly enough, I think doing martial arts has actually subconsciously substituted some of that, because I think it's weird. It's like, I think a lot about how bodies are put together now, which is weird to say, but also think about different body types, because that affects a lot of what you do in martial arts, as far as what your strengths and weaknesses and how to compensate for your weaknesses goes. I have a very I don't know, I have a non-typical martial arts body, but I'm also just big and have a lot of momentum when I move, so I can topple over people, and there are definitely weaknesses to compensate for, and I've gotten to help train and teach people and realize that it's like, oh, these people have this different body type, so they perhaps will have to do this. But it's weird how cross-disciplinary so many things can be, where you just wouldn't think. Where martial arts, obviously, it helps you learn how to, like, script an action scene for some things, but I think more importantly, it's like, oh, this tells me how a body goes together, or how, like, how a person naturally stands, things like that. It's very strange. Another thing I learned is anti-perfectionism. This is something that I had learned a long time ago, kind of, but probably also why I don't do a lot of really finished drawings is because I do them and I realized that I don't really care about perfecting this one artistic piece. I'm like, do I really want to spend 12 hours on this thing that's just like one drawing that I don't like? Do I care enough about this thing? Whereas I care much more about finishing comic pages and telling a story, because that's honestly why I learned to draw. I like telling stories with the drawings. So if you want to get a comic out and you want to get it consistently, then you really have to take perfectionism and toss it in the bin, because then perfectionism is just another form of relying on mood and motivation to get things finished, when that is never going to supplant discipline. And perfectionism is the absolute enemy of discipline. This is a very interesting video I watched by a psychologist that I watch online called Dr. Grande. And I thought it was interesting where he did, and this is a tangent, I'll bring it back, but he did a video on obsessive compulsive personality disorder, which is different in many ways from OCD, but it's essentially the classic idea of perfectionism. But it was interesting where he said this, like, people with OCPD don't necessarily have a high level conscientiousness, or do they necessarily perform really better, because and I think it's because the focus on perfectionism doesn't really translate that well into, like, actual perfectionism, because it just stands in the way of things like discipline and things like that. But he had more to say on that, which I thought was interesting. Obviously, I don't have anything like OCPD. I've met some people that probably do, but obsession with rules and perfectionism and things like that, it doesn't really help you improve in any way. Just the only thing that will help you improve is focusing on improvement, I think, not focusing on perfection. And besides, as I learned as a child, the only person that was perfect is Jesus. So, like, why are you even trying? Hashtag atheist life. Yeah, so that goes back to next point, make progress. Progress is better than perfection. And this is not so much drawing, but, like, long form writing, where I had written novels before this, and then I had to learn how to, like, write comics, and I just kind of cruised into Four Tales thinking, and was like, yeah, it will work fine, but really I had no idea how the concepts of things like timing and panel layout and just the passage of pages and conveying the passage of time in comics worked. And I was just like having to learn all these new things. Thanks, Scott McCloud. But also just tying those all in and learning to focus on things in like long-term arcs and then breaking it down into chapters and breaking it down more and more. Definitely has improved my ability to grasp long-form writing. I also learned that probably, as far as webcomics go, but this helps a lot of comics in general, I've definitely come down the side of, even if you're telling a really long-form comic, it really helps to break things down into, like, almost episodic chapters, where it's not necessarily, like, a monster of the week or anything like that, but having a very central arc within that chapter and not just it being a subdivision of a longer story, really, I think that is a really good way to tell longer form comics. What did I learn about not drawing? I don't like artists. I work with artists, and I will say many great things, but I also have learned from interacting with artists in real life that I probably just shouldn't hang out with other artists. Like I said, I'm not an artist. Obviously, I only draw 2 hours a day, so, not an artist. But maybe I'm being a little sarcastic here, but I even the artistic side of myself, I get annoyed with. Just my personality does not really mesh with the typical artist personality. And I think a lot of those things come back to aside from just things like discipline and trying to mesh people with quote-unquote artistic personalities is fraught. So I enjoy artists from an arm's length now at best. But the other thing is just... what was the term I was going to use? The kind of search for finding meaning through approval, and this is very big. Obviously, this happens more just because, as a programmer and a person working for an online webcomics company, I work within an online medium and interact a lot with an online medium. But online especially, people put works out there, not one for, trying to monetize, trying to raise popularity to hopefully turn that into a career for a lot of part, but a lot of it is literally just like searching for exterior approval. And over the past year or two, I've just completely tossed that idea in the bin, where I'm like, exterior approval is nice, but honestly, like, I'm like, I already feel great about this thing I do, and so I don't really need exterior approval. But more just because I kind of realized that what I do artistically is more about just kind of telling these stories in my head and experimenting with them, and a lot of them are kind of conversations with myself and things like that. And I'm like, it's more of an outlet for me. I like to do a lot of different things, and I think that putting too much... I also was kind of like, do I even value the opinions of these people who I'm putting this out for? Probably not really that much. I mean, Trump got elected, so that's already like half of people you can just write off. So I was becoming very, very solipsistic in my view of being this kind of very typical artist that is pretending not to, but very much is going out looking for approval. And I was just like, I don't really, I like getting feedback, and it's nice to have, my friends being like, oh, that's nice, and that's cool and everything, but it was like, I just mostly want to do my thing and put it out there and I think for me, I'm more like, I like the idea of having an opus of stuff I've created that kind of is permanent and exists, and literally I have the books on my shelf of these things I've made, and I can look at them and be like, yeah, I got something out of these past few years. And I was able to, do something that was completely me and just, a complete trying to hone a craft and express myself. And I'm just like, yeah, I think that's worth more than, 15-year-olds commenting on my online comic, which it's funny because, my comments are usually perfectly fine, but sometimes I get a comic where I'm like, they're like, hey, why is May doing this? I'm like, you mean Emmy? You didn't even get the character's name right. So I'm like, wait, never mind. I shouldn't care about these these children. And often the children are 30 years old, but don't worry about it. I also learned, I mean, this is very much over the past 10 years, but I learned that I didn't want to make a living drawing. And I don't really know if, I don't think I ever really had the inclination where I was always like, I wouldn't mind if the few hours a day I spent on comics and drawing got a commensurate amount of financial recompense, just because it would make it easier to justify. But I also don't really care. Like, it's nice now that I have a Patreon that essentially pays for my supplies and everything like that. So it allows me to invest a little bit in the actual equipment, which is funny because for the most part I don't buy like any equipment. I buy paper, I buy pens. I got a little workplace now. I might have enough money soon to just go ahead and splurge on a Cintiq instead of a third-party thing like I have now. But I think I realized early on, and I had realized this with writing and stuff as well, is like, I wouldn't like to do this 8 hours a day. First of all, it would hurt my hands. Second of all, it would hurt my brain. And third of all, there's just other stuff I like to do several things throughout the day. Unfortunately, with our current capitalist society, we don't really make a lot of room for that kind of lifestyle. But which is funny because it's kind of what people used to do, is they didn't do, unless you were an artisan, you weren't just doing one thing all day. But but I was kind of like, yeah, I'm okay with this just being a hobby forever. Especially because that means that, once again, that exterior approval is not tied to my bank account that much. So I can, have as many children doing as many violent things as I want in my comic, and without having to worry about anybody getting offended, because violent things are happening, and I'm sure that they had perfect, wonderful upbringings where nothing violent ever happened in their childhood, so it's fine. Violence doesn't happen in the real world. But I don't have that much trouble with that. But it is funny what people will think is an opinion worthy of expression. I mean, I drew a whole 1,000 pages to express my opinions, so I don't know what they've done. But I was like, oh, there is something very freeing about, like, not having to worry about making a lifestyle out of it. And maybe the production is substantially slower than what it would be if I did 8 hours a day, but also my mental health is a lot better. And I have other things that make more money anyways, so I guess that's just my smart person programmer privilege. So learn a skill that pays well enough for you to have a hobby on the side. Yeah, that's my lesson. I'm going to stick with that. But yeah. Anyways, that turned into a lot longer of a video than I intended. But maybe I'll look back at this in 10 years and be like, it was nice before the Fire Nation struck, or something. It was interesting. This video is a primary source immediately before the Trumpian coup. But we'll see how that goes. 20 days, man. 20 days. So that's it. That's my slideshow about how I hate art.